We're in Hebrews chapter 1. We're looking at verses 8 through 10 this morning. Well, 8 through 9 at least. He says, "But to the Son," he says, "Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever." Now, this quote by the Hebrew writer is taken from Psalm 45, verses 6 and 7, which reads, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. You love righteousness and hate iniquity. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions and by anointing you with the oil of joy." Now, this represents the ultimate contrast between the Son and the angels that he has been showing us over the last few verses. Of the angels, he says, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire, but of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." That shows a sharp contrast. The contrast is a simple one. Angels are servants of the king. The Son is the king. Quite a contrast. Now, a great deal of controversy has been generated over this verse, over verse 8, as to just how this verse should be treated grammatically. And the challenge comes largely from the camp of those who deny Jesus or deny the deity of Jesus, or who otherwise challenge the idea of a triadic unity. However, not all who challenge the reading of verse 8 do so from these types of motives. Some reconstruct the translation in such a way as to reverse the order of the subject and the predicate nominative, which would make it read, "God is your throne forever and ever." This would dismiss any divine address to the Son as God in this verse. And indeed, there are some English translations that so render this verse. Moffat translation, I think Berkeley translation, Goodspeed, I think renders it in this way. There are a few others. Most of them are either one-man translations or probably translations of which you've never heard. One notable translation would be the New World Translation, which is the Jehovah's Witness publication. But there are two major questions that I think need to be explored in this clause. One is, which noun is the subject and which is the predicate nominative? For you English teachers, you'll like this. Any English teachers left in here? You don't teach English, do you?
I teach all areas, but I'm pre-K.
Oh, okay, well, this probably won't appeal to you then either. Yeah, well, you still had to take English in school, didn't you? The second would be the nominative for the vocative argument. Now, dealing with these kinds of questions, especially from the standpoint of Greek grammar, can become quite involved. Needless to say, as much as I would enjoy taking you through all of this, I do understand that for most of you, this would have very little meaning. That being said, not only that, but the fact that it would not be particularly practical for a class of this nature. I started to not even go into all of this, but since I have had to respond to these arguments quite a number of times on different places on the internet, this is obviously a question that is on the mind of a great many people. So what I'm going to do this morning is just simply offer a couple of basic arguments that will at least set the ideas in your mind about how this is to be treated. But if you desire a more detailed presentation of this material, then links to all of these classes will eventually be placed on the church website. The first argument, the first question would be the subject predicate question. Now, strictly from a grammatical position, since God is nominative case, it can be translated as either the subject or the predicate, either one. Now, because it is in the nominative case. And just on the other side of the coin, all nouns that are subject are in the nominative case. That doesn't mean that all nouns that are in the nominative case are the subject. Is that clear? So, how to determine the subject from the predicate is not always that easy, particularly in Greek, because they don't follow the same grammatical structure as in English. The issue in this verse is that throne is also nominative case, which means there are two nouns in the same clause, both in the nominative case, both having the definite article, where one is the subject and one is the predicate. Question is, how do you determine which is the subject? It makes a difference because it defines how you read this verse. Now, Bill Moons makes an observation about identifying the subject from the predicate nominative, the predicate in the nominative case. I didn't say that right. Bill Moons makes this observation about identifying the subject from the predicate in the nominative case. He said, in English, the subject and the predicate nominative are distinguished by word order. That's absolutely correct. In English, how do you determine which noun is the subject? It always comes first. Always. This isn't true in the Greek. Yeah. This is not true in the Greek. In the Greek, word order is much more flexible. In Greek, word order is more for emphasis than it is for any kind of grammatical function. So other means have to be employed in order to be able to determine the subject from the predicate. Now, in fact, he gives one of the three rules here, Moons does, that we'll be looking at in a moment. He says, for example, if only one of the two nouns has the article, then that noun is the subject. So, how to determine which noun is the subject in verse 8. Now, here are some helpful rules in Greek for determining the subject from the predicate. If there are two nominative case nouns in the clause where one noun has the article and the other does not, then the noun with the article is the subject, the noun without the article is the predicate noun. Also, if neither noun has the clause, or in the clause has the article, then the first noun in the word order is the subject and the second is the predicate. If both nouns in the clause have the article, then the first noun in the clause is the subject and the second is the predicate. There are a number of other rules that could apply that need to be considered, but none, I believe, that would really overturn these. But so for the sake of brevity, these are going to suffice. These will be sufficient. Now, in our text, the third rule clearly applies. This means that according to established rules of Greek grammar, the subject of verse 8 should be, your throne, O God. Your throne is the subject, God is the predicate nominative. Thus the better rendering would seem to be, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Now, the second argument is the nominative for the vocative. I think this is an outstanding argument. And it's right on par with the previous one. But the second argument of the nominative for the vocative, Wallace informs us that although God in this clause is in the nominative spelling rather than the vocative, it still functions as a vocative. And when you look through the New Testament, this seems to be the rule rather than the exception. Almost, well, I'm going to say every time where we see God addressed in the New Testament, it is always in the nominative case. Yet in every, well, with the exception of one place, and that's Matthew 27, where you have the crucifixion scene. Get to that in a moment. But in every case, except for that one, God is always in the nominative, yet the force of the nominative is always vocative of address, without exception. Now, the nominative for the vocative is a very strong argument. I'm not going to do that. Just let me give you the difference between Matthew 27:46, where Matthew uses the vocative spelling. God is always addressed in the nominative, but in Mark 15:34, where Mark recounts this crucifixion scene, you see Jesus making the same statement, yet Mark uses it the nominative spelling, where Matthew uses the vocative spelling. And it is the only case in the New Testament where God is spelled in the vocative form. That's the only place it happens. So this gives an incredible amount of validity to the vocative or the nominative for the vocative argument. Yes.
I don't know what vocative is.
Other than the spelling, I'm not sure I really know. Vocative usually applies to address. Father, mother, like if you're addressing them. Nominative, you're speaking usually about someone, is the difference.
Just a name.
So to and about, like you, the first one.
Right, to and about.
To someone would be the vocative and about someone would be the.
No, yeah, right. Yeah. Vocative address, you're addressing them directly. Nominative, there's like 5 cases of the spelling of God. You have theos, which is nominative, that's the most common form. You have accusative, which is theon, just about equally amount of use there. Then you have theo, which is just simply God. Could apply to anything. Then you have the theou, which is genitive, and you have the which is vocative. These are just the different forms of the word. And they all apply to different uses, how you address them, how you talk about them, talk to them. Anyway, you can look in any Vines or Thayer or Strong's and see how the different words. Thayer is really good because he really goes down and explains the different uses in their different forms. Now, getting past all of that, Hebrews 1:8 is just simply another example of this type of grammatical construction. Now, in verse 9, this same grammatical construction is found yet again in the phrase, because of this, God, your God, has anointed you. This is nominative spelling, but it is vocative of address. Here again, the case is the same. Now, the only place where you have actually a vocative address in this text is in verse 10, where God says, "And you, Lord, in the beginning," and Lord is in the vocative spelling. So the force of the nominative functioning as a vocative offers a very strong support for the translation, "Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever." So this establishes the throne, or the subject. This establishes the throne as the subject, and God, or the Son, God is the predicate nominative, who is the possessor of the throne, and the Son is the God who occupies the throne. The eighth credential. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. That's from the New American Standard reading. Now the Son is the rightful holder of the scepter of the kingdom. The scepter is what? This is the symbol of ruleship, isn't it? This is the symbol of one's right to rule, to administer justice, to extend mercy, to judge the people. This was to become Judah's right, as Judah held the scepter in trust. In Genesis 49, verse 10 tells us that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. Now all of this points to Judah as the type and to Jesus as the antitype. The until represents a transfer of the scepter that would mark the transfer of authority. Question. It says, the scepter would not depart from Judah. When did Judah receive the scepter? When did the scepter come to Judah? I don't think this would apply to the wilderness wanderings, because there Moses held the scepter of judgment. Moses held the power of judgment. When he died, that authority passed to Joshua. And when they crossed over the Jordan and Shiloh is established, where the tabernacle was set up in the land of Ephraim, the scepter remained with Ephraim there for the entire period of the Judges, because the tribes of Ephraim judged Israel along with Dan from time to time, judged Israel through the entire period of the Judges. So you still don't have Judah in possession of the scepter. When did it come to Judah? When would you think? Who was the first in Judah? David. You have a list of kings. You have Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin. Scepter does not pass to Saul. He has the rule, but he possesses the scepter. But when David comes to the throne, now that scepter belongs to Judah. And from that time on, it stays in the possession of Judah until he comes whose right it is, or until he comes to Shiloh. Let's see here.
Jacob, when he was blessing his family, didn't he give it to Judah, or did he just give him the double portion? No, he gave it to Ephraim.
Joseph has
The
the
double
double
portion.
portion. Yeah.
Mhm.
But other than Joseph, Judah received the highest blessing, I think, of all of the others. But this is where God set, that's where God set the tabernacle, was there in Ephraim, and it remained there until David decided, until the Philistines captured it,
Yeah.
and they returned it to where?
Or whatever.
Kiriath Jearim. They returned it there. Well, it stayed there until David came along and he moved moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem.
But it stayed somewhere in between because, what's his name, touched it and died.
What was that guy's name?
Again with a U, right,
Uriah was the one that touched it.
yeah. Obed.
Obed, house of Obed, yeah. So it stayed there until he offered the appropriate sacrifices and until he could move it properly. But the scepter hadn't come to Judah until the inauguration of David. And he was the first in Judah to possess the scepter, and from that time on it would never again depart from the house of Judah. What does the word Shiloh mean? Rest. Until he who comes, who is the rest giver, or the rest bearer. Canaan was not the true rest. Canaan was merely the representational symbol of the rest that was to come. So when the true rest bearer came, the scepter would be transferred to him. Judah simply held it in trust, but it belonged to the true king, to the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Yeah. So to him shall be the obedience of the people. So Shiloh then, in this prophetic pronouncement, is now personified. Shiloh is talking about a place, talking about someone. To him shall be the obedience of the people. So the scepter does not belong to a place, it belongs to the person. Now the Hebrew writer is telling us, or showing us, and confirming for us that the scepter of the kingdom has indeed passed to the one whose right it is. Thy scepter is the scepter of righteousness. Loving righteousness. I think everyone here probably is familiar with the concept of agape love. Agapao expresses a great deal more than just simple emotional or existential response. It's more than that. This response is an elevated level of devotion. This is the kind of love that seeks the highest standard of good for the sake of someone else. This is love that seeks to accomplish the highest standard of consecration. And Jesus sought the highest standard of consecration for the sake of righteousness. This was reflected in the purity of his life, wasn't it? He gave himself over wholly, completely, to the will of God, to the will of the Father, as was observed by the disciples in John 2:17. When you see him for the first time cleansing the temple, the zeal of the Lord, the zeal for the house of the Lord has consumed him. They understood Psalm 69:9, and they understood to whom it applied. Hated lawlessness. Now, hated, you have a word, Maseo here, and this word, I think, is understood greatly. It actually has two levels of meaning. It can mean, this is the same word that Jesus used when he said, if anybody loves his father or mother, his daughter or sister, or so on and so forth, more than me cannot be my disciple. Anyone who doesn't hate his father or his mother can't be my disciple. Same word Jesus uses. Well, it can mean to hate or to detest, to utterly despise. This represents an complete absence of love for someone or something. And it's used in such way, in such passages as Revelation chapter 2, verse 6. But this I have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Romans 7:15, where Paul says, "For what I'm doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do." What a contrast in feelings for things. Luke 16:22. "Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and cast out your name as evil for the sake of the Son of Man." The second level of meaning is on a comparative level. These are two entirely different levels of meaning. Help Word Studies informs us that Museo means to love someone or something less than someone else. So it does indeed carry that meaning as well. In other words, simply to renounce one choice in favor of another. In Luke 14:26, where Jesus said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate Museo, love less than the Lord, his own father, his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers, sisters, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Now note the comparative meaning, which centers around a moral choice, elevating one value above another. You can look at Strong's on this as well. So this stresses the presence of love for both parties. I love my parents, but I also love the Lord. But if it comes down to it, I've got to make a choice between them. Love your wife. Now it comes down, you may have to make a choice between them. Love your own life. There may come a time when you may have to make a choice between which one you love more. So both parties, this represents a case where both parties are indeed loved, but a choice must be made between them. One can't love both lawlessness and righteousness. What was it Jesus says? Or what was it Paul says? You love one and hate the other. Can't love the Lord. Well, Paul addresses it too, but the Lord says you can't serve Mammon and God. You'll either love one and despise the other, or hate the other and despise the one. Or hate the other and love the one. So these are two extreme opposites. You can't love both lawlessness and righteousness. Now, it would seem then that the stronger meaning is to be preferred here in this verse. I think it unlikely that the implication is that Jesus loved lawlessness less than he loved righteousness. You don't get that idea here any more than you would if you look at those who hate you and exclude you and revile you and cast out your name as evil. They're not doing this because they love you less. They're doing this because they hate you. Now, lawlessness, the word amen, from which we get the word antinomian, one who is contrary to law. The word is typically translated as sin or transgression, unrighteousness, disobedience, or iniquity. So this represents any thought, speech, or behavior that is contrary to law. And the standard of law to which the Son is devoted is what? Not the Constitution. It's the law of God. The law of God has to be the standard by which we measure everything in life, every commitment in life. Loving righteousness necessarily then involves learning to hate or to detest all that is contrary to righteousness. If God can't fellowship with sin, then neither can the people of God. in Jesus' life, as we're going to be told later on in chapter 4, there was found nothing that defiled. Nothing was amiss. Nothing was contrary to law in his life. And as we're going to learn from 1 John 1:5, in him there is no darkness at all. And this represents a level of purity and moral integrity that is absolute. He is absolutely pure. He is absolutely righteous. There is nothing in him that defiles. For us to wear the name Christian is going to require we be redeemed from lawlessness to be a people for his own name, zealous unto good works, burning desire to achieve good works. This is loving righteousness and hating lawlessness. This is loving and seeking a standard of righteousness that is reflected in Christ himself. Remember in Romans chapter 6, Paul says that we've been freed from sinful practices, and these sinful practices are those deeds of lawlessness of which we are now to be ashamed. These are those lawless deeds of our former lives which we now hate. Because Jesus loved righteousness and hated iniquity, he was anointed by the Father. And the anointing oil was an important part of the Old Testament regimen. It was done to set apart one to divine appointment for special service or work, such as prophets. Prophets were anointed, as you see in the case of Elisha in 1 Kings 19. You see the anointment of Aaron and his sons to the priesthood in Exodus chapter 30. You go to 1 Samuel, chapter 1? Then, chapter 1 Samuel chapter 10, and then 1 Samuel 16, and then you go to 1 Kings chapter 1, and you can see Saul, David, and Solomon anointed as kings. So you have this threefold function of anointing to set in place prophets, priests, and kings. To that end, Jesus is anointed as prophet. He is the final spokesman of deity. He is the one through whom God speaks. He is heaven's spokesman. He is anointed as high priest. He is the one who made purification for sin and then sat down. He's anointed king. He's the possessor of the throne, the scepter, and the kingdom. The oil of the anointing was the gladness of the Father. And according to Thayer, the words of gladness here implies exultation or extreme joy. He explains the word was usually used in connection with the anointing of one's head at a feast, thus carrying the idea of joy, of a joyous occasion in which the one being anointed is blessed. That which incurred the favor of the Father is what? The Son's love for righteousness. What was it the Father said in Mark 1:11? This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. God has anointed you above your companions. A lot of speculation has been offered as to just who these companions might be. Some have suggested that these companions may refer to the angels of verses 5 through 7, over whom Jesus is declared preeminent when you consider the various contrasts offered between the Son and the angels. However, I take exception to that theory because angels are a lower rank of being. They are created beings, always occupying subordinate roles, subordinate positions. And in relation to the Son, angels are not fellow anything. They don't compare to the Son in any way. Others have suggested that companions may refer to Christians, for using the argument, for we are made to be kings and priests, Revelation chapter 1 verse 6, and the fact that Revelation 20:6 says we reign with him. Well, this may be a possible application of the term, but it really doesn't seem to fit the context of chapter 1, and it certainly doesn't seem to fit the context of our verse. Dodds, in his comments on this verse in the Expositor's Greek New Testament, suggests that it is probably preferable to keep the term indefinite as indicating generally the supremacy of Christ. In other words, Dodds doesn't know what it means either. This approach seems to, I think, ignore the specific nature in which this word is used. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion. This is my opinion. You can take this for what it's worth. I would suggest that this implies to a specific class of companions who occupy like positions. What is the context? Since the immediate context is presenting Jesus as king, then those regarded as companions in this context would seem to be those who are fellow kings. These are those who occupy themselves thrones. These are those who are exalted, who are eminent, who are sovereign in the earth. This would not imply angels, for they are not appointed as rulers and sovereigns. Angels do not possess thrones. Notice the inferences here. Thy throne is forever and ever. This stands in contrast to all others whose thrones are temporal and whose thrones are limited in time and will be left to other succeeding generations. His scepter is the scepter of righteousness, as opposed to what? Those kings whose scepters measure out injustice. You love righteousness and hated iniquity. The contrast is to those whose reigns are characterized by evil, unrighteousness, oppression of the innocent. He stands over and above. In this, Jesus is anointed above his companions. He is sovereign over all others who possess thrones, scepters, and kingdoms. Jesus is indeed King over all kings and Lord above all lords. At least that's what he tells us in Revelation chapter 5. Hence the decree here. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. We're past time. Questions or comments? We'll pick up in verse 8 next week. Still. Oh wait, that's the wrong one. I'm sorry, we'll pick up in verse 10 next week.